live. Hello, as people join us, welcome. We are going to just take a minute or two to settle in here, but this is our Past It Classics live show for The Pillow Book. Ooh, of Say Shonagon. And we were discussing right before we went live that we all have different translators for our copies. So there could be a myriad of experiences here based on that, which I think we will discover pretty quickly.
Yeah. I realized too that even the length of the translation is going to vary quite a lot. I'm sure we'll get into that, so I'll save my thoughts on that. But the introduction to my edition was interesting.
Taylor, did yours have an introduction and did you read it?
I read 60% of the introduction before I was like, okay, I'm done. I want to read the actual book. But it was really long, and it did get go into certain decisions the translator Meredith McKinney made with certain words, or how she interpreted certain things. Many historians interpret this as a joke. I think this was meant to be taken seriously and stuff like that, which I thought was interesting and gave a little background to Say Shonagon's life and stuff.
Yeah.
But it got to be a lot, and I was like, I get it, it's an old book.
Yeah. And I do wonder if yours being the only one translated by a woman will make any difference.
Yeah.
I think it might.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we'll get there. Okay. But so since I guess we are clearly eager to kind of dive in. So content warnings for the book itself would definitely include classism, animal abuse, and animal death. And then depending on your translation, things like footnotes and introduction probably also bring up Orientalism and colonialism and all the isms, really. So there's that. But yeah, this is, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is now the oldest book we've read for Past It Classics.
I think you're right, actually.
Which is kind of a cool thing that I didn't know I was going to achieve, but I did. And I guess rather than, typically we would ask what's your familiarity with the author? So I'm just going to ask instead, what's your familiarity kind of with Japanese classics or Japanese history in general, really? And then I guess if you want to just dive right in with your rating as well. So whoever wants to kick us off.
I can go.
We always have to pause at the beginning.
Please don't everyone volunteer at once.
Kara, are you? Also, Kara, it looks like you have this really nice fan blowing in your hair. It's very magical.
It's glamorous, yeah.
This is my shampoo commercial, also known as we're under a heat advisory and it's miserable. So
you should have just been what fan?
Everywhere I go, this is what. Yeah, my hair.
My hair just does this. It's so weird, you guys.
Yeah.
So as far as Japanese literature, off the top of my head, I can't I don't remember having ever read a book by someone from Japan. I've read some Japanese American literature, like Nisei Daughter. But in terms of translated works, as far as I don't remember reading anything from Japan, let alone something this old, which I thought was really interesting, especially reading someone's diary from over 1,000 years before today was interesting. And also I just really liked reading how some people's problems are just still the same today. Whenever Say Shonagon was I hate it with the sound of babies crying and closed spaces. So I'm not actually sure what I'm going to rate this, because I enjoyed it more as an audiobook, which my audiobook translation was Ivan Morris. I found I enjoyed it more listening to it than I did reading it. But also it feels weird to rate someone's diaries that she never even intended to have been read. So I think I'm sort of like nebulous. I will say I enjoyed the read a lot and I found it very informative, but I don't know if I can accurately give it a rating based off of the fact that she wasn't necessarily writing for an audience.
Interesting. I love that you've already foreshadowed like 4 of the things I want to talk about. So
Oh.
good work.
Love that.
Kara?
So I have read a few things by Japanese authors that have been translated, but they've all been modern books. As far as Japanese classics, I have read some like folklore and like mythology stories. That's something that I, even as a kid, I always really enjoyed, and I read them from like various different places. And Japan was one of the cultures that I did read some from. So I would consider those like Japanese, ancient classics.
Yeah.
Although obviously those are in translation and like depending on how the stories are edited, blah blah blah. Other than that, I haven't really read anything older from a Japanese author. And as far as history, I think just probably like the basics that you learn in school. Like I enjoyed it and I was interested in it, and I think I sought out a little more about it because I was enjoying like the folklore and that sort of thing. But by no means do I feel well grounded in ancient Japanese history. Yeah, and then so we were talking already about like the translator and how different the experience is going to be, and I totally get, Taylor, what you mean about, like how do I rate someone's diary, especially one that really feels like she wrote it for herself, like not for publication at all. I feel in this case, I feel pretty comfortable rating it because I am rating my translation, which I didn't love. So the translator for mine is Arthur Whaley, and I didn't really look into the translation, which I should have, but I got this copy because it was accessible, and I was like, oh yeah, like I think I've heard of this like classic publisher. That seems seems solid. I did not realize that the translation by Arthur Whaley is like he did that in like the 1800s or something, and there is a foreword by a modern author, Dennis Washburn, but I just like, I don't know. It's kind of what you would expect from an 18th century white man translating a Japanese book. Like, there were some parts that I still really enjoyed, and actually one of the biggest takeaways from this book for me, besides the fact that I definitely want to read it in a different translation, already just from the little we've said about it, I'm like, oh yeah, I need to, like, I thought this would happen. But then also like one of the biggest things for me is like I think Sei Shonagon just sounds like such an interesting person, and I would love to meet her. Like just like what an interesting, complex, messy,
yes,
fun person. Like I don't know, she just, you would not be bored if you were friends with her, Yeah, so I think the like personal parts are one of the things I enjoyed most. My edition did have some like cultural context and commentary, but it was so weirdly structured because like apparently this is considered one of the best translations in terms of like preserving the original like poetic feeling. And I get that there's always that balance between like an accurate translation and a translation that like sounds good and sort of mimics that part of the writing. But the way it was structured was so bizarre to me because it was like the translator, Mr. Arthur Whaley, he would just like have this little bit of introduction and then he'd have a big chunk of text from her and then he'd jump back into commenting on it with like no real division between them. And he did that through the whole book. And I found that distracting and hard to like figure out who was talking, but also the fact that like at the beginning of my translation, his note, like his translator's note, is literally like, yeah, I only translated a fourth of it because the rest of it was boring. So here are like the good parts. And I'm like,
oh my God.
What? Like it was just, yeah. So this is a good lesson to me to like look into a translator a little bit more, or at least like the edition. And like there were definitely parts where it's like I think he made some interesting points, or like he, you know, for his time there were some things that I think he was like fairly forward thinking about, but there was a lot of other stuff that like even the complimentary stuff was like a racist. Like he's talking about how like, well, the ancient Japanese, they only lived in the moment. They were very much like only for the aesthetic, like no history, no future. They were just, and it was just like very uncomfy. So anyway, I feel like
the ancient Japanese approach to life is YOLO.
yeah. It was so weird, and like it just felt like even when he was praising some aspects of their culture, it was very much like, I don't know, fetishizing or like infantilizing. Like he's like, oh, they just sat around doing their like pretty little poems instead of like doing philosophy and science and blah blah blah, which also is not even true.
No.
So, yeah. I feel like I talked a lot about this, but I have feelings about this situation. What a time. So like I'm at a 3 stars. Some of it was great, and some of it I'm like, Arthur, like why are we still printing this translation? So anyway.
Wow. This is already like so interesting. I'm just like, tell me more about your opinions, ladies. I love it. Yeah, so I also feel very kind of in the middle about this book. I think part of it is just the fact that I certainly don't speak Japanese, and in my lifetime will never be able to read like what her writing was intended to sound and read like. And I feel like losing the poetry of it diminished what would have been some of my enjoyment, because like even in my version they were like, yeah, so sometimes like the language was so beautiful and there's only so much we can do in English to kind of like mimic, you know, whatever, like the assonance or the repetition or whatever, like, you know, we can include some of it, but it doesn't always work when you translate it. So that's just like kind of an unfortunate side effect of a translated work. I did enjoy many of the anecdotes and things, but she also, I think I said this to you guys in the group chat, had the Lucrezia Marinella listing like disease where everything has to be a list. I'm like, maybe that's like some of the 3/4 that he cut, in which case I'm okay with that.
I think it must be, because I did not like, I remember you saying that in our group chat, and that was one of the first indications that I'm like, oh, these are really different translations. I have not had a single list. Like,
really, they got rid of the list for you. That's interesting, because it was mostly lists, which sometimes I liked, and then sometimes I was like, I know this is your diary, so this is probably just you thinking about things you don't like, but can we move it along? I want to hear about all of the lovers that all of these like, noble women and ladies in waiting have, please.
Yeah, truly. Because some of the lists, and we'll dive more into this, I think were like interesting and showed us a lot of like personality and about like life at that period. But then some were just like mountains. And I'm like, I don't need to know the name of every mountain in Japan right now. Like, this is not Jeopardy, okay?
At one point, she has a list of like bugs. And
yeah,
like,
there's one that's just insects.
These are the ones I don't like.
Let's sort bugs, everybody.
Yeah.
That is so interesting, because I'd be curious if you guys had any like footnotes or introductions about that part, because I think this was the translator and not the forward. I don't remember, because nobody divided up their writing, or at least the translator didn't. They like talk about how court poetry was such an important part of what they did, that when you went to take a court position, I think especially, I guess not especially women, but in this case, obviously women included, you would actually bring with you these like this like supply of like adjectives almost, and like beautiful descriptions and different names and references to like literary allusions, because that was a big thing. So I think one of the ones they mentioned is like the list of mountains in Japan, so that if you were like, you know, writing something that needed a rhyme, or if you were like trying to think of a like poet, like another poet's like allusion to something. So that's interesting. But I do agree, it's like, I'm glad I didn't have to read through those. Maybe Arthur did something right with that part.
Maybe one thing right. Yeah, but overall, I guess I'll sum up my thoughts. I did just give it 3 stars. Like, I did not dislike reading it. I don't regret reading it, but I don't think I'll ever reread it.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm thinking now if I were to rate it, because I don't think I'm going to give it an official rating, but I really liked it, and I think it's just a matter of translations.
Yeah, it could be.
Because I'm like, honestly, I would read this again. It's very.
I want to read a decent translation. Yeah.
I'll send you mine. I'm done with it. Okay. But things seriously that both of you have said like are all my questions. So
wonderful.
So prepare for a little bit of repetition, a little bit of unpacking of thoughts that have already come up. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about genre, because this is interesting. I would like to hear like how you would define this book. Like, is it memoir? Is it just a straight up diary? Poetry? Like, we got some narrative nonfiction going on. Like, where would you kind of settle this book in if you had to like shelve it at a bookstore other than classics?
Yeah. I think diary would be the closest, because that implies like a lot of like personal writing and just like your thoughts and everything. But it's like a combination, like diary / I don't know, like in older time periods when they would talk about a memorandum book, that's like what it reminds me of, because it's like, it's a diary, but then there's also like lists, and there's like, oh, I heard this quote and I thought it was great, and there was like, oh my god, this dramatic thing happened the other day with my boyfriend, blah blah blah. So I guess if I had to pick one, it would be diary, because that's diary / memorandum book. But yeah, my edition also talked about how the pillow book is a specific like genre of diary, and that's what it was in ancient Japan, was like, it was a diary, and it was also just like all your thoughts, like it could be so many different things. So I feel like I didn't really answer your question, Julia. Maybe I'll change it to memorandum book. That's what I would call
it. I like that. I had described this to someone as like an ancient girl's notes app on her phone, essentially. So yeah, memorandum feels right.
Comments.
It really is. Yeah.
Yeah. I would categorize it as a diary as well. I do feel like memoir has an air of intentionality to it. You're specifically choosing what to leave in and what to leave out. And in her last entry in my edition, she mentions that like she never meant to have this be seen. And she was like, I wrote a lot of shit about people that I didn't want you to know about. So I feel like that lack of intention is what sort of keeps it as a diary for me. And I would shelve it in, well, classics, yes, and translated works, but also nonfiction. Yeah. Because she tells a lot of truths here, so I don't, like, there's a lot of stuff she's saying that I'm like, that has to be true. You wouldn't
like, that's too weird and specific to be made up. Like,
and like the end where she is writing like, oh, this was found and shared among people and stuff, it reads, at least in my translation, like a Twitter notes app apology. Like, we're meant to get out. I said a lot of mean things about people.
I'm listening and learning. I am taking time away from social media. Yeah.
I didn't mean to spend like 6 pages on a guy who I literally refer to as a laughing stock.
The way, yeah. And it was even funnier because it was like, in my edition, it was like the beginning of a section. So it was literally like chapter break, sort of, and then nobody can take this man seriously. What a clown. Like, she just went off.
I think she also says, like, his parents must be so embarrassed to have given birth to such a fool.
Brutal.
And some of the stuff she described, I'm like, he's just like existing. I don't know. It was funny.
Well, every time you guys bring something up, I'm like, I got to change the order of what we were going to say because you already talked about it. Yeah. So Sei Shonagon ends this book literally by saying, whatever people may think of my book, I still regret that it ever came to light. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about like why you think she felt that way. Obviously, Taylor made the great point already of like a lot of truths were said here that
and she named names.
Oh, yeah.
That's the thing for me.
No aliases for anybody. She said it with her full chest.
Yeah, it's not like telling stories where you're like, my friend, let's call her Sarah. Like it's whoever it is, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a great question. And I also, that part was not in my edition. So
Wait,
this
really?
yeah. There was, they did include the part where talking about how like it was like published basically accidentally. But that line that you guys are talking about isn't in my edition. Which is interesting because one of the parts that I did like about some of the questionable translating choices, I really liked the commentary when Arthur Whaley was talking about her personality. Like Sei Shonagon, like as a person, like it seems like he did genuinely admire her, and not just her writing craft, but like, I don't know, it felt very like friendly when he was talking about her. And one of the parts that I liked is that, and it actually does go back to your question, Julia. He says that like a lot of times when we get like journals or memoirs or anything like that, there is this layer of like artificialness because in some way the people writing them were like, this might get, read by somebody else someday. And Sei Shonagon did not. And so because she did not think that, she was so like honest about herself. Like she talked about all these like contradictions, and she was like, mean to people sometimes. And it was very honest, and I feel like the translator admired that. And so I think that answers the question that Julia was asking, which is like, she did, she regretted it being published, not just because like she said things about other people, but she like really exposed herself, and in a way that was like very human and vulnerable, which I imagine, especially for like a court person, was not ideal. So that's my sort of roundabout answer to that.
Yeah. I'll just echo what Kara was saying. And the thing that I think also intended to sort of be kept secret, but that I found really juicy, was how much like sex a lot of the noble women were having, and all these gentlemen running in and out. And I'm sure that's one of those things that's like maybe an open secret, but also you don't want it written down, and you don't want someone writing down about your late night escapades. But I don't know, it just seemed so interesting because you think of like that time period, especially with the upper classes being very like stiff and all about purity and stuff. And there's a lot of drama going on.
I know.
Once I found out that husbands didn't usually live with their wives full time, I was like, oh,
what? That explains it.
Yeah. But I think that and like other liberties she takes and things she thinks about other people is sort of like, I guess, ties into the fact that it was just never meant to see the light of day. And I have to say, the fact that someone found it and shared it is like still like a nightmare scenario for me. Someone finding your secret writing.
Yeah. And especially
high school.
Yes. And it especially reminds me, like Taylor, you were saying, like a notes app apology is like what part of it felt like. And the comparison I would make to like a different part of it is like it really feels like if somebody got a hold of like your DMs and like
Yes.
published them, because I feel like, because you know, like she was like, yeah, bad mouthing people, but it wasn't, I don't know, not like doing it behind someone's back is like better, but it's like she wasn't intending to say these things to them or to say it to somebody else who could use that information to hurt somebody. Like I feel like this was the equivalent of her just like, man, I'm so mad, I have to get this off my chest.
Yeah.
And then that gets published, which, as you said, Taylor, nightmare scenario. I feel none of us should be judged on the contents of our yeah, and so I can't even imagine how horrifying that would have been. Like,
Yeah. I feel like it would have been one thing if it's like, whatever, you're like in your like elderly years and you're away from court and they're like, oh, share your journals that you were always writing. And she's like, oh my gosh, you guys. Or like if it was like posthumously found or whatever. But
yeah,
for them to be like, yeah, we want to read it. It's like, I would be like, oh my God, don't do that, please. But okay. Probably don't have much of a choice. But yeah, it is. I think, Kara, that's like an apt description of like, because I say to people at work, I'm like, venting is like a normal thing. And if you have a hard day, like do that, but don't do that at work. Like that's not appropriate. Go home, like talk to your partner, send your friend a voice memo, be like, oh, this is the crazy thing that happened to me today. Like get it off your chest that way. And it's not meant to come back around where the person involved in that story will see it. So it's like,
yeah,
totally different experience.
Yeah. My version also, her personality, or not personality, I guess, but her like the way she portrayed herself felt very, very different at the very beginning of the diary versus the end, which again, you know, very subject to translation and them deciding which parts to include. But at the beginning, it felt like she was very like shy and reserved almost, and like didn't want to put herself forward. She was like so overwhelmed at being in the Empress's presence and all this. And by not even like the middle, like it was before the middle of the diary where she's like, and then their boyfriend snuck in through the window, and like, it was really interesting. So I wonder how much time was between those, because like everybody changes as they get older. But it was interesting because like there wasn't a textual note, I don't think, explaining that, or
that's a good point. I don't know the length of time during which this was written. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think the thing that also complicates it is that it was done so long ago when like they weren't using the Julian calendar.
Right.
And also the time is different. At least in my translation, they would use things like the hour of the tiger or the hour of the monkey, which was so interesting. And I guess if I was reading my physical book, I could look up and see what time that was. But I was like, oh yeah, monkey time.
Yeah. Well, and like I didn't realize, one of my little notes was like, oh, a Japanese hour takes 2 hours of what we would call. And I was like, I did not know that. Like, is that still true?
Really?
That's so interesting. Yeah. I don't know if that's still like a system they use. I would guess not, because so much international business happens. But yeah, it's like there would be these little tidbits of like context or information that I did find really interesting and helpful. But I don't remember there being like the translator would note certain years sometimes, but I don't remember there being any kind of like, and now time jump, you know, like 10 years later when she is much more worldly.
I have this little bit in my introduction that is not very concrete, but a little helpful. Some 50 sections of the Pillow Book, representing about 2/5 of its total length, can be dated by methods that are on the whole reliable. It would have been a simple matter to rearrange these sections in chronological order, possibly putting them all together in the first part of the book, which would then become a sort of diary. I have, however, preferred to retain the confused time sequence of the traditional texts, not because this was necessarily the order in which Shonagon arranged her book, but because any systematic reorganization would be arbitrary and possibly misleading. If one thing is clear about the writing of the Pillow Book, it is that Shonagon was not keeping a daily or even a monthly record of events. To suggest this was her intention would falsify the spirit of her work. Yeah, so I mean, I would guess who knows how many years.
Yeah. It does say that the last entries were done around the year 1000.
Cool.
So that's at least where we know it ends.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, like, there are quite a few, like, specifics. Like, I guess this is what, Julia, your book was saying, where it's like, there are very particular time periods you can nail down because it's like, oh, this person had just become minister. This was right before the Empress's second child was born. So, like, there is some kind of chronology you could do. And I totally get why they wouldn't want to rearrange it. You know, like, I think that's true. I think they make a good point that that's adding, like, another layer of interpretation that just wouldn't be justified. But I also wonder, I'm like, I feel like that could tell us some interesting information, though, you know, about how she, like, grew and changed. Like, I don't even remember how old she was when she first came to court, because I thought she was maybe pretty young, like, you know, maybe upper teens or something. But then from something that she said later, it sounded like she was already a, I don't know, somewhat, like, worldly woman, you know, like maybe in her 30s or something. I don't know.
There's, like, this one part in the book where she, like, goes to meet a friend for, like, a pilgrimage up a mountain, and she mentions that, like, she got so tired walking up, and there was this young woman who was, like, about 30 years old just walking up and down the mountain, and she was like, this is my 7th pilgrimage of the day. And Shonagon is like, I hate her.
Yeah.
So I assume, like, near the end, I would assume maybe, like, her 40s or something.
Mm-hmm.
Younger than 30.
Yeah, wild.
Yeah. I also, I like that you brought that part up, Taylor, because I don't think I have that specific section, but, like, it does include a couple of, like, the temple visits that they made and, like, pilgrimages and everything. And one of the things that struck me, and that the translator also talked about, is, like, how she would be very, like, playful and, like, flippant about it, and then there would be this, like, passage that was, like, very profoundly moving to her, you know, about, like, hearing, like, the bells and, like, when there's nobody else there and everything. And I'm like, I wonder too if that, even, like, parts like that could be not embarrassing for her, but, like, that would be you'd be very exposed. Like, just imagine, like, having your, like, deepest internal experiences published for people to read. Like, even if they are not things that are embarrassing, that would still be, like, the terror of being known. I don't know. The mortifying ordeal of being seen in ancient Japan.
Literally nothing has changed.
I know.
Yeah. Like, I would read it and I'd be like, yo, girl, same. And then she'd mention something about blackening her teeth. And I was like, oh, right, this is ancient Japan. And they did that.
Yeah, like, the number of entries that were her basically like, don't you just hate it when men? And I'm like...
Oh, yeah, I did love the one where she was like, I hate when there's men visitors and the women just feed them. I was like, oh, okay.
She's like, I'm trying to get them to leave.
Yeah.
Do not give them refreshments. Like,
please don't offer them food. My God.
It's like they're strays that'll come back and you give them. Where there was, like, the part where, like, everybody was all aflutter because, like, oh, one of your admirers, he, like, came and waited for you in the rain, and she's like, show off. Like, if he really cared about me, he would come no matter what the weather was, rather than being concerned about who was going to tell, like a story about how devoted he was, and I'm like,
Mhm.
that makes sense. Like,
On
funny, but I get it.
On one of her lists of things she dislikes, it was like when a man stays the night and the next morning he won't stop talking to you and like won't get out of your home. And I'm like, girl.
Too real.
Yeah. You remember for the Lucrezia Maranello one, we were talking about just like imagining being at like a slumber party or something, you know, like a girls' night with her. I think Sei Shonagon also has to be at that girls' night. Like, can you even imagine? Can you imagine?
The discussions would be amazing. I'm like at a fork in the road because you guys lead me in literally every direction I want to go in, and I don't know which way to go first. Okay, let's keep talking about the author herself, because I think you've both made some great points so far. But yeah, like, what are your impressions of, say, Shonagon, not only like as a writer, but also just as sort of this character in her own life as we're seeing it? Yeah, what are your thoughts on her?
I don't remember whose turn it is.
I think it's yours, Taylor. I think.
Okay. So I really liked her. I think the way she writes, because, you know, she's just writing her thoughts, but it gives a lot of insight into who she is as a person. We know she's very, very smart. We know she's funny, and we know that she seems to be like a pretty loyal friend, unless she's talking shit about you. But in terms of her flaws, you also get this idea that she's very elitist. She's very judgmental. And maybe like a little too much for her own good. And I think that's really interesting. She doesn't seem to realize that she's being elitist. And I know for that time period, maybe it wasn't seen as elitist, but her, like, at one point she's like, peasant homes are so ugly. And I'm like, peasant homes, they're going to be.
If you're a peasant, your roof should actually look like this. Think better next time.
It's like the Emperor's New Groove. That it's like, what do you need? Food? It's like, maybe you should have thought of that before becoming peasants. Like,
I love that. But I found her like incredibly fascinating, and at least with the two translations I used, she seemed like a very like real person, which obviously she was, but like, I don't know, just sort of reading her diary and reading about both her flaws and her strengths, I found myself like really, really enjoying her.
Yeah. I agree with everything you said, Taylor, and I'm glad you mentioned that at the end about, like, you know, being such a real person, because that's, I think, one of the coolest things about this reading experience for me, even though we all had somewhat mixed opinions about some of it, is like, it is so cool and important, I think, to have these reminders that 1,000 years ago people still had just as much like personality and like spirit and I don't know, like inner life. Like, I think there's a tendency to think of previous time periods as being like, I don't know how to explain it, but it's like almost having less like individuality between people, you know, less personality, less like characterization almost. And I think reading things like this, it is so cool to get such a like dramatic example of how that's not true. Because I agree, I think Sei Shonagon felt so real. And I think all the descriptors you gave, Taylor, I definitely agree with. I also feel like she is like very sure of herself and so confident. And like, I think that comes from how smart she is, how creative she is, like the fact that she excelled at these sort of like poetry games that were such a big part of what court people did. So she's brilliant. And I also agree that like maybe that can kind of lead her to be mean-spirited. because there are times where I think it is just more like teasing, you know, that she's being clever and she has to say, like, she has a comeback, so she has to say it. But there definitely are lots of places too where it really does feel like she's not like too clever for her own good, but she's so in love with being clever and being accomplished that she'll do it at the expense of anybody else.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like overall, I still think she's such an interesting person. I would love to meet her and have a conversation with her. And I also agree that, like, yeah, the classism is a big detractor. There's one part in my edition where, like, she's talking about how like, if a servant girl ever calls somebody a gentleman, you know he's the worst. And I'm like, okay. Like, he's like hideous, bad manners, like all this stuff. Okay, girl. Like,
yeah.
But yeah. So well said, Taylor. That's my summary.
I want to bring up, there's this other part in the book where she has another list of distressing things or something, and one of them is when the servants are sleeping next door and you hear them laughing.
Deeply upsetting to me when the servants laugh.
So distressed right now.
Oh my gosh. I mean, yeah, I think you both really hit the nail on the head. Taylor, I especially also really like the use of the word real, which of course is literal. Yes, she was a real person. And I do think that kind of ties back to this being her journal and, you know, not meant to be consumed by other people, because you can read things that were really written by real people and, you know, it's like a letter to so-and-so and whatever. And it just feels kind of like stilted or formal, or like they're kind of censoring what they want to say a little bit. Because it's like, what if this got into the wrong hands or something? But because this is just hers, like, it was like, we saw her flaws, we saw how clever she was and how funny she could be, but, you know, it's like a little bit of the good and the bad. And it did make her very overall likable to read from, just that it was so honest.
Very human.
Yeah.
And that's interesting too, because that almost feels like maybe one of the benefits of having it sort of all just thrown together, you know, collected, like different vignettes and time periods and lists and memories. Like, one of the things maybe that I feel that does actually help with is creating that full picture, and how there are so many contradictions. And like, you would have an entry about I don't know, something like, you know, very mean-spirited about, like, you know, I hate when ugly people like stand in front of the carriage, like, get back behind there where God put you, basically. So she'd have something like that, but then the next section could be something like really kind, or it would be like an interaction with somebody where you can see that she could be much more generous with the way that she viewed people or something, or the parts we talked about at the temples, like that there was such a difference in how she like viewed things and experienced things. So like, I wonder if, even though it is hard to follow the timeline of when everything is happening, I wonder if it does kind of contribute to like showing that humans are so complicated, and that was true 1,000 years ago too.
Yeah.
Here. In terms of the grand scheme of things, I would love to know, if it did this book challenge or impact your perception of ancient Japanese life and culture? And yes, examples. I think, Taylor, you might lead in with this because you already mentioned it a little bit, but just like kind of the romantic and sex lives of the court. I was like, wait a second, what?
Keeping up with the Heian court ladies, like.
Kara, I think it's your turn.
Yeah, so I love that question, Julia, and I think my experience with it is probably going to be really different, because like the translator that I read, I feel like was already making so many value judgments that I feel like I was arguing with him in my head the whole time, rather than necessarily thinking about how what I was reading either fit or didn't fit with that. Yeah, so I guess I would say that, like, I did not realize, or I didn't remember that the artistic, like, construction of poetry was so much a part of, like, court politics and, like, your job. And it was like a huge embarrassment if somebody didn't get, like, the couplet that you were referencing, you know, like, that these were like big things. And I feel like the way that my translator interpreted that could sometimes be very well, like I said at the beginning, sort of like infantilizing, is like, look at them writing their cute little poems instead of like doing important things, you know, living in the moment as the Japanese do. Like, just weird things that it's like, I think this is racist, but I don't even know like what stereotype you're using. It just feels bad, Arthur. Yeah, so I don't know where I was going with that.
He was just trying to create his own stereotypes. He's like, actually, this is true about all Japanese people.
Yeah. I guess it does kind of fit into the whole like mystical person of color sort of thing,
like
where he's like, oh, they're so like, you know, in tune with the present. They don't have to think. They don't have to plan for the future.
It's so exotic of them, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Which is also like wild, because in the same source that he's like talking about that, it's like, well, you're translating all of these incredibly detailed like literary allusions, and like there's like the history of these different like offices. And I also, it was really hard to separate out if there maybe was a sort of seed of truth in what he was saying, because like when he was talking about, there was like a period of ancient Japanese history that was like no, like modern is good, and like that is like what the aesthetic was, that's what you wanted to have, that's what you wanted to be. And that's something where I'm like, maybe that was true, but I can't really learn anything about it because it's buried under all of your like xenophobia. So, anyway, that's my confused answer. You're welcome. Enjoy figuring that out.
So like you mentioned, Julia, like obviously like learning a lot about the romantic and sex lives of this, and how many women had men like climbing out of their windows in like the morning. Great, loved it. But something else I thought was interesting, and I know I keep going back to this, like how many modern day scenarios are in this book, but how that is juxtaposed with ancient Japanese history and culture. So like on the list of things she hates, one of them is like, oh, when you're getting your teeth blackened and the person doing it tries to talk to you. And it's like, oh, it's like when you're at the dentist and your dentist is asking you questions. And I don't know, just putting that side by side is like so fascinating to me. Or like, you know, when someone talks to you and you want to say something witty and you don't have anything, and that sort of like pairs with not having the right couplet to a poem in public, and you're just so embarrassed by stuff like that.
Yeah. When she talks about like sending, like you send like a poem reply to somebody, and as soon as you send it, you're like, oh, I just thought of the best line. And I'm like, yeah, like I really love how incredibly similar like some of the like struggles or like the funny things that happen, or even like there was this extended scene about going to see a cuckoo, and at the beginning it's like a bunch of other, I guess it was like Sei Shonagon and like her inner girl squad, like there was like a few of them who were like, let's go see a cuckoo, it's gonna be fun. And then like a bunch of other girls wanted to come with them, and they were like, I really don't want, like when you make plans with a friend in front of somebody else and then they're like, I can come, and you're like, like
we weren't actually inviting you.
Yeah, which also, you know, very rude thing to do, but it was just really funny because I think a lot of us have been in one of those, one of those situations, one of those positions, or you're witnessing it happen to someone else and you're like, I was just along to have a good time and now I'm very uncomfortable. So anyway, I'm sorry, I think I cut you off, Taylor.
No, you're good. I mean, that was a really great point from the book that I really liked. And something else that I love is once again, one of her mini lists of awkward things. One of them is when a man has left his wife and he runs into his father-in-law at the market. And I'm like, that's so funny.
Mm-hmm.
Just those little moments that are like, oh, this happens every day now. And we really, even though we're removed both from time and country and culture, it's just so similar to how we live our lives today. And there's something very, I think, comforting about that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so fun seeing how playful people always have been, there's so many scenes where it's one of the guys comes in and this other woman doesn't see them and he's like, oh, don't tell her I'm here. And so they it's one of those things, of course we know that previous generations had a sense of humor, but do we really know that? Do we really think about that as being something that you don't have to live in 21st century to have,
yeah,
just very humanizing, we've been saying.
Yeah, it's when you get one of those listicles that's Victorian people taking silly photos, and it's a man with his tongue out. That's how it feels.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I totally agree with both of you. I had pretty much slim to none even concept idea of this time period in Japan. I mean, literally, I'm sure everything I was imagining was just an amalgamation of every period drama and stereotype I've ever absorbed throughout my life, right? So, anytime we were given a new piece of information, whether it was culturally significant or a location or just a silly thing, I was like, huh, didn't know that. Okay, I like it. So, yeah, I do feel like it illuminated quite a bit for me.
The part where she's oh, sorry, Taylor.
No, you go ahead, Kara.
The part where she's like a friend of hers or something is yeah, this guy really wants to know where you live, and she's like, don't tell him. He's like, I didn't, but if he asks me again, and she's like, don't tell him. And I was like, this is so oh my god, relatable.
Don't tell him.
There's another one near the end where she mentions that she doesn't like these new high clogs young men are wearing. And I'm like, this is literally an older person going the kids today in these fashions, the sagging, the clogs.
And buns, yeah.
Oh, truly incredible. And so another point that, again, Kara was kind of talking about, because you both are on top of it, and I love your brains. Just little kisses for your brains, gold stars.
We all just collectively hive mind a huge discussion.
So much. Truly. I think I manifested it when I was like, I don't know what I want to talk about yet. And you both were like, we have talking points ready. And you sent them telepathically to me. But yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit more about how poems and poetry are utilized in this text, and as well as how would you describe the role and importance of poetry in, is it pronounced Heian? I don't know how you say it, honestly. Period court life.
Saying Heian, but I honestly don't know where I got that from. So your guess is as good as mine.
I don't know. Okay, but in the court life of this period, as it was depicted in the books, because I think, or the singular book, it's just this book. We only read this
one book.
There's actually a sequel, The Pillow Book 2. Electric Boogaloo.
It's the Comforter book.
Pillow book, yeah.
But yeah, how would you describe the role and importance of poetry as it was depicted here, I guess, to summarize that very long, wordy paragraph I just had?
Well, clearly it's a way of speaking amongst like the elite. And what I thought was interesting, which I had forgotten from my high school AP World History class, which was the bane of my existence. But I did remember that like Chinese was really popular back then too. It was considered like in fashion. So I thought it was really interesting when someone would remark like, oh, they wrote the poem in Japanese and Chinese, which I think sort of furthers this idea that it's for the elite and they're trying to stay in fashion. But also it's a form of communication, sort of like how you judge someone you've met too. Like how good are they with poetry? Like how good are they at like thinking off the cuff? And
Right.
I believe there's one point where say shonagon like fails at like a poem and she's just so humiliated and like embarrassed because that's sort of, I guess, seen as a reflection of your cleverness and like
Yeah.
how well you fit in
For
with
sure.
support.
Yeah.
Well said.
Well said indeed. And it's like such a huge endeavor, like the amount of like memory that they have to
Yeah.
pluck these references at the drop of a hat and then use those to like they would all just like sit down and the empress would be like, everybody write me some poems, and they had to be good. Like this was not like we're gonna have fun and just hang out. This was like, I want you to create art for me right now. Here is your prompt. Like it's wild, and it's such an interesting way of like showcasing somebody's talents. Like I don't know enough about like other cultures and time periods, like the way that they used writing politically to like make a comparison, but it's so interesting to me that like you have this medium that is, it's simultaneously showing how brilliant and clever and like well read somebody is, especially women, and at the same time it is like this very like romantic sort of thing, like the and like the penmanship, like how handwriting was such a huge thing. And Taylor, how you were talking about like the language that you wrote it in, and my copy even had a note that was like there was like a specific kind of poetry, or several kinds, that like was so popular in the court, but that it was considered effeminate for men to use. So that this was like heavily weighted towards like women being really good at this. Like it's fascinating. I just find that so interesting. And again, all of these things that we've been talking about, it's like I don't understand how, well, I guess I do understand because he was a man in the 1800s. It's like how he can look at all of this and be like, they're funny little word games, like
What a simple people.
Yeah, and it's like he is complimentary about writing ability, but the way that he frames it in like the culture is very odd. It's very like, this is what they're doing instead of all these other things they could be doing. It's like, well, no, but they're doing those at the same time. Like that's one of the things that's amazing about it, is that this is art, this is communication, and this is politics. This is a way for at least like elite women to have power. Like it's just, yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, so true. I almost feel like it's, and this is, forgive me, because this is like a dumb comparison, but I've always said that I'm very envious of On Whose Line Is It Anyway? Like the way Wayne Brady can make up a song and it's funny and it rhymes and it goes with whatever the thing is, all of that at once. I'm like, I wish I could do that. Like that's how I feel like they were writing poetry, where I'm just like, you did that all just off the dome. It's incredible.
Yeah.
Wow.
I don't think that's a dumb comparison at all.
I thought it was really good. And now I have the image of like people trying to do improv in the Imperial Japanese court.
Well, right? I feel like to an extent, it's like, yeah, Japanese, whose line is it anyway? Where they're like, and make it clever and make it rhyme and make sure it has an allusion to this.
Yeah.
And bonus if you can write it in Chinese.
God, I would fail so terribly at this.
And I didn't even realize, like, I mean, and again, that's a thing where I'm like, I guess I should have figured that like China and Japan had some kind of relation just based on like geography, but I like had no concept that they would have like such strong feelings about like, oh, and can you read and write in Chinese also and speak it, and this is the trend there, and like all those things. I was like, wow.
Yeah, that it was like you said, it was a trend. Like it was like you're only fashionable if you're writing in Chinese and doing these other other things.
Yeah. What I think is also interesting is in my version, say shonagon mentions like Chinese architecture also being brought over and used in the imperial like palace, which I think is so interesting too, because you tend to forget that back then other cultures exchanged things and things were considered, you know, it's fashionable in China, so we're going to do it here.
Yeah.
This is back to like a story that I heard in when I was in AP World History, but there's a Chinese court record of Chinese people coming from trading in Africa and bringing a giant spotted dragon with them. And they had brought a giraffe to the palace. And just that like cultural exchange is just insane to me.
I love calling a giraffe a dragon. That's incredible.
But I guess if you've never seen a giraffe, you're like, I don't know what that is.
A land dragon? Yeah.
I would have no concept of what to even compare a giraffe to. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like maybe a stretched out horse.
Yeah.
Right. Through a taffy puller.
Yeah.
Tall desert.
The Mike TV of horses is a giraffe.
Oh, wow.
Fantastic classics out of context thing.
Yeah, you both knew exactly what I said, but out of context, what is she talking about?
So many layers of backstory. Very appropriate for this book that there's like those different allusions, you know?
Well, look at us. We're referential. They would love us in the court.
Right. Like all the things that we're talking about with like how much skill all of the writing that they do takes, it also is like interesting because it sort of puts in perspective for me some of say shonagon's less pleasant qualities, you know, like the fact that she could be a show off and she could be kind of mean spirited when she had a clever line, and it's like, not that this excuses it, but it's interesting where it's like, if that was your whole like social currency, like, yeah, of course, if you're really good at this, yeah, you would be savage about it.
Right. I feel like almost to an extent, and again, a little bit of a silly comparison, but it's like you get invited to a rap battle and then you like really diss the other person. It's like, they can't be mad at you. You're in the rap battle together.
That's right.
That's what you were here for.
I mean, honestly, I think that's an apt comparison, like a rap battle.
Oh.
And I'm thinking of, you know, that gif of like all the guys like running and screaming.
When it perfectly loops, that one. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
like,
the reaction anytime she would talk. Sorry, Taylor, what?
Shonagon is the like smug guy, like in the middle.
Yeah. That's incredible. Okay. I know Taylor has a tight deadline today.
Actually, I'm probably not gonna go because I am very tired.
Okay, great. Then don't worry about what I just said. I have two more things that are more loosey-goosey that I do want to talk about before we go into quotes. One is just like open forum, like if any of the anecdotes in this book like really particularly stood out to you and it's just like on your heart, like you want to talk about it, now's your time to bring it up, because I know there are some real interesting ones.
I love the way you phrased that question.
Yeah.
Oh, I did like, well, it was both really sad, but also sort of charming. The story about, I think the Emperor's cat was like Lady Naribu, who had like an Empress's headdress.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But then the poor dog, but I don't know, the idea of having a cat with just a little headdress on and apparently acting like she owned the palace because she was so naughty.
That's so cat of her, honestly.
It really is. It
Oh,
really
cat. That's very funny.
is.
Was it a Charlie XCX reference?
No, but it should have been.
That's what I thought you were doing.
In honor of the Empress. It's a reference.
Okay, wait. That would be just such an amazing sign off to any like pet picture, like cat photos you're sending in honor of the Empress. Just sort of an addendum to one that we were talking about earlier with the guy who came to her and he was like, hey, this guy really likes you, and she's like, well, I'm not interested, and he's like, I know, I didn't tell him your address, but he's gonna ask me again, and she's like, don't tell him. And then he like sends her a letter later, and this is after he told her he's like he had to stuff his mouth with seaweed to like not say anything. And she sends him back a piece of seaweed. It's so funny. And then he's like, you must have mistakenly sent me a piece of seaweed. And she's like, bitch, did I stuff her? Oh my god. Like, Sei Shonagon truly would have been queen of the internet. Like,
for real. Yeah. Believe me, the internet would have been standing for sure. Oh my gosh, you just reminded me of one of the sections that I liked, and now I'm gonna have to find it. So thanks.
Okay. Well, while Julie is looking for that, there's one in one of her many lists, but she's talking about when a woman and her lover get in a fight, so she like stubbornly like gets out of bed and she's like, I'm not sleeping here next to you. And she like walks away and she's like, oh, but it's really cold. And it's kind of like, it's too dark for me to walk outside and it's kind of scary. And so she gets back in bed and like snuggles up next to her, and her lover's like, are you done being mad at me?
Yeah. And she has a little like aside where she's like, I recommend only quarreling with your lover in the summer months. Like,
yeah. Oh my gosh. Why is she so funny? This is going to take me forever to find. So if you think of another one, please just jump right in. Not even quotes, just like anecdotes, as I said, because that's really what it is. Oh my gosh. Why didn't I mark this one?
Even, yeah, so like her heading, very tiresome things. When a poem of one's own that one has allowed someone else to use as his is singled out for praise, like that obviously is a very specific thing, but it's also not, because it is so similar to like if somebody's like, hey, I need help with something, like, I don't know, for work or like, you know, in school or anything, and you're like, yeah, I can help you, and then it's like they get the best grade on the project and it's like, excuse me, I didn't say that you could use my work and succeed. Like,
mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, remember the one with the little snow mountain? And she's like trying to keep it from melting the whole time?
Oh, yeah.
And then in the end, she was like, no, I was doing so good. And then someone was like, I think the Empress just didn't want you to win. So she made sure it melted.
oh, here's the one I was talking about earlier. If one hears a servant girl say about anyone, he's an awfully nice gentleman, one at once feels a slight contempt for the person in question.
Diabolical.
There's like a little story in the beginning during like some festival, and all of the noble ladies have these gruel sticks, and the idea is if you slap a woman on the thighs, it'll make her fertile. So this one woman is like, her husband is visiting her, and they like run over and they just start slapping her legs with sticks. And she's like, guys, stop it.
Girls' night.
Get your gruel sticks.
Okay, this is going to drive me nuts that I can't find it. So I'm going to poorly describe the one I'm looking for and assume that maybe you guys can help me tell it. But it was like, I think she wrote a letter to somebody and then all the men gave her a nickname that she didn't like. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't know if I remember that.
Oh my gosh. It's going to drive me nuts.
Oh, something that I think is important to mention about this book is that the author's title is written as it would be in Japanese. So Sei would be her last name, and shonagon would be her first name.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
That is good to know. Well, and actually my introduction was like, is this her birth name? Is this her court name? We'll never know. I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah, okay, so that is true, but like
But also,
yeah, because the Empress refers to her as shonagon several times, and I was like, oh, is that like calling her by her last name? But then I was like, oh no, it's reversed.
Mm-hmm.
I also, this is another like thing that is just a very human inconsistency where like anytime she would be anywhere with like the court and like they're getting like, you know, kind of special treatment because they're like the elite ladies, and she's like, oh, it's what we deserve. And then anytime they're anywhere and somebody slightly more important, she's like, what a snob, get this like monster out of here. She's like, I get to cut in line, you don't. Like,
I love that.
It really is so relatable, though, honestly, where sometimes I'm like, listen, good things just happen to me. It's what I deserve. And then someone else is lucky. And I'm like, no. Oh my gosh. I'm never going to find this one that I'm looking for. I'm like trying to Google it at this point because I'm like, what if it's one of the ones that was in my audiobook that isn't in my physical book? Because what I do anytime I'm like listening to an audiobook, but I own it, is like anytime I read a big chunk, I like move my bookmark so I can be like, ooh, progress. But it was so hard to find where I was every time because I'd be like, this isn't exact. So we may never know.
also, I'm realizing I misestimated Arthur Whaley's lifetime was 1889 to 1966.
Oh.
So actually, you should have known better, sir. Like,
yeah, this was probably like the 1900s at some point.
Where was he from? I'm curious. Like, was he English? Was he American?
That's a British name. Arthur Whaley, come on.
I think he was. Yeah, he was British. It says he taught himself Chinese and Japanese after being appointed assistant keeper of Oriental prints and manuscripts at the British Museum.
Well, I guess he should learn Chinese and Japanese.
I don't know about how I feel about him teaching himself, though.
Yeah, like it's like that's impressive. That's, you know, great. But also the fact that his translation is still, I don't know, clearly it's popular enough that it still gets made into editions, but I don't know.
But is that just because it's a long and arduous task to translate a work, and so they're like, well, we already have one?
Right. Which is like, I'm sure there are actual Chinese and Japanese people out there who could help.
That would be nice.
What a concept.
I guess depending on when he did the translation, because there are some years where they very much wouldn't have been available.
Oh, absolutely.
True.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's true.
Okay. If you guys feel good about where you're at with the random anecdotes, I know we don't normally do this until the classies, but I kind of have a little game for us.
Ooh.
Yeah. This game is called Let's Add to Some Lists. So I have chosen a few of the lists that are really included in this book, and I thought maybe you could help me supplement, say, Shonagon's ideas. So if you'd like to help me, we can start anywhere you'd like, but I have awkward things, things that should be large, and also outstandingly splendid things.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, so take your pick. Or we can just round robin any which category you'd like, wherever inspiration strikes.
I like the idea of round robining.
Shall we think of some awkward things?
Yeah.
Right. I'll nominate when you're talking about someone and then they enter the room.
Yes. Little Taylor anecdote. I did that once, and then I realized they were in the elevator with me.
Oh my God, Taylor!
He was my professor.
Oh no!
To this day,
Oh,
thinking about it makes me want to die.
Yeah.
Oh.
I can jump in with an awkward thing. I think this is pretty universal. When you think someone is waving at you, so you wave and smile at them, and then they walk right past you to someone behind
And
them.
you're like, yeah.
I was at an audition a couple weeks ago, and someone waved that I know from so far away that I like waved and I went, me? Because I like I was like, I know you know me, but I don't know if you're waving at me. Thankfully she was.
Good.
But I think
awkward things when you are messaging somebody like privately and also you are in the same group message and they reply in the group message to something that you said. And you can't, and like then the people are like, hey, what is that in response to? And you're like, nothing, don't worry about it.
Never mind. Yeah, you can't explain.
Yeah. Not anything really bad, but just bad enough that you're like, I did not intend to say this. Like,
like, oh, they know what we're talking about, or they can guess. I can pop in with one that happened to me recently.
Oh, goody.
When you share what you think is a fun fact about yourself, but then you realize it's probably really weird.
Oh, no.
I was talking to a guy on Bumble, and I was telling him, if you guys have seen the Hellboy movies, I don't know if you have.
No.
I know of them, yeah.
I'm aware of them.
The creature Abe Sapien, I had a huge crush on him when I was younger. I wrote so much fan fiction about it.
Oh, boy.
And me and this guy were talking about, like, I guess movie crushes. And I was like,
sorry, I just Googled it.
See, but you have to watch the movies. He has a great personality.
This is The Shape of Water, Taylor. What are you talking about?
I like The Shape of Water too, but that's a different story.
Yeah.
I didn't bring up
because it was self-insert fanfic for you.
And I like brought that up to him, and I was like, I was so silly. I had a crush on Abe Sapien, and I still think he's kind of cute as a character. And then he unmatched me.
He's like, I guess I don't look fish-like enough. He's never gonna date me.
I was like, maybe that was a weird thing to share. Like within the first 24 hours of talking to someone.
It's a little much, Taylor. But I respect you. It's another awkward thing. Getting ready for your day and then getting to a destination and then realizing like you've forgotten one thing that's like every day and you just didn't do that thing that day. Like, oh, I just didn't put on mascara somehow, or like I just don't have any jewelry. Like that is so awkward to me. It feels awkward personally. No one else cares. I'm like immobilized.
If it's like something that's like a signature thing for you too, like I can see why it might feel like off.
Yeah.
No, without jewelry, I'm naked. Might as well have shown up in my underwear. Please.
There's something my mom did that I think is very funny. So I would like to nominate when something you're wearing like has broken or torn or gone wrong and you don't notice.
Oh.
My mom once drove to Walgreens and thought she was having a stroke because she didn't realize that one of the lenses of her sunglasses had popped out. She was seeing like, I don't know, her vision was really weird.
Yeah.
So she was walking around Walgreens and she's like, I can't believe this. I'm going to die in Walgreens.
Oh my God.
She got in the car and looked in the mirror. I don't know why, if she thought she was having a stroke, she was going to get in the car again, but
yeah.
That's such a mom thing.
Like, I drove like that and walked through Walgreens.
That is honestly, that's so relatable though, in that I remember one time I remember one time being outside on the playground at the end of the day at work, and it was like a winter day and it was snowing lightly, but it was lovely. So the children, were outside, we're all bundled up playing, they're getting picked up. I'm like talking to parents, I'm talking to teachers, I'm talking to children, very normal interactions. The day ends, I go get in my car because I'm going to leave work. I get in the car and all of my mascara is completely off the lids, eyes. And I'm like, how many people didn't say anything to me when I was walking around like this?
Oh no.
No one thought to be like, there's something on your face.
I am so sorry.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I took a Snapchat of it so I could forever remember, because I'm like, no one's gonna believe me about how bad it looked. Like it was full like black.
Another awkward thing, when you're halfway through telling a story and you change your mind, but it's too late, and so you all just like suffer together. No going back.
Yeah.
Nobody's having a good time, but we have no choice.
Okay, what about things that should be large? What are some things that should be large?
Fun size candy bars.
Ooh.
True. They should just be regular candy bars.
If you say fun size, what about smaller candy is fun?
I'm having less fun personally. I get to eat it for a shorter amount of time. Yeah. So true.
I would say the amount of money in my bank account should be large.
So true. Yeah, the number of hours in a day should be large. I need more of those.
I think my cat Bento, when I want to use him as a pillow, he should be large for that. He's such a skinny legend. I'm scared I'll like crush him.
Oh, hairbrushes and combs.
Yes.
I have a lot of hair and I'm tired of breaking things.
I'm imagining you like brushing your hair with the comically large like hair.
Like the proportion of like a Barbie to the Barbie hairbrush. Yes. Sometimes it's what's necessary, I think.
Yes.
Things that should be large.
Boston apartments. For the price I'm paying for them.
I would say apartments across the board should be large. Yeah, it's really not
minimum
fair.
Wage should be large.
Yes. It should be large wage.
Large wage.
Yeah. I'm satisfied with that category. About outstandingly, I can't even say it, outstandingly splendid things.
When your kitty comes up to you and you think that they're going to do just like a little rub, and they do the really hard rub that they like, against the leg, and it's so cute.
Yeah. That is outstandingly splendid.
That is incredibly splendid.
It's like, wow, I just got showered in extra love.
I think we can all relate to this. Reading a really good book, like a book you know is going to be a favorite for you.
Yeah,
absolutely. An experience I've had very few of this year.
Oh,
it's very upsetting to me.
Prayers, Julia.
But not to change the subject. Currently 1/3 of the way through. I have good feelings. Okay.
I'm so excited. Speaking of which, outstandingly splendid things when your favorite author has another book coming out.
Yes,
so true.
And when you're surprised, like you didn't know to expect it, and it's like, happy early birthday to me.
Yes,
so true.
Past it classics. Not
We're biased, but yeah.
I agree.
When you don't check the weather before planning your outfit, but it happens to be just right for the conditions outside.
Yes.
Outstandingly splendid.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Oh, getting into your bed after you've washed your bedding, like freshly washed. And I will also add, this isn't universal, but getting into your bed after you've shaved and lotioned your legs. I like to like cricket my little feet.
You do like the little
Especially those two together. Yeah.
Yes.
The fresh body, fresh bed, all of it.
Mwah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Sorry, I like the idea of describing shaving your clothes as fresh body. Clothes, shaving your legs.
Well, you have to wash your body usually when you're shaving it. You don't just, I mean, I don't know. I guess I've had an emergency shave here and there, but typically I'm already bathing or showering
Yeah.
when I shave. You guys are good at this game. I like this.
It's fun to think about.
Yeah.
See, we could have a pillow book. We could do it.
Good.
Okay, well, do we want to finish up with some quotes? If you have any direct quotes you want to share.
I think I sort of already jumped into sharing. So.
Sure. That was
Also-
kind of accidentally on purpose with the anecdote.
Yeah. Oh, something, and maybe this is just like, maybe I was just like misinformed or something, but I, for some reason, was under the impression that when the pillow book was by a Japanese courtesan, like that's how it was always described to me, and like I feel like courtesan has a very specific meaning. Like we don't usually use it to mean just a court lady, a court person, you know.
Yeah.
So that was very interesting to realize.
Is that
one change might have been made? Yeah, see, even on the back of my edition, in her diary, a young courtesan of the Heian period provides a highly personal account of the intrigues, dalliances, foibles, and habits of Japan's 10th century elite. Like, I feel like that's misleading.
That's just not what that word means.
Yeah.
I think they wanted to say like a courtier. Like
yes, or like
Yes.
a court lady, a court attendant, like, which obviously not that there would be something wrong with reading a diary that was by a courtesan. I just find
I
that
would love to read that personally.
Yeah. I just find that very like odd that I think I have almost exclusively heard that description.
Yeah. Mine literally just says a court lady, which accurate.
Mine says court gentlewoman.
Okay, yeah. Interesting. Does that come back on old Arthur? Is that his fault?
I don't know, because I've heard it a lot of other places as well.
And I think it's easy to like come to that conclusion too, because I think of pillow book. I'm like, oh, like you know,
exactly. Like
she's
pillow
dead.
talk.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know. It's very interesting.
I only have 2 quotes marked that I want to share, so I'm going to do one really quick that I have ready, which is just one of the funny ones.
Yeah.
Anything that cries out at night delights me, except babies. Birds, insects, beautiful. Babies, shut up.
Yeah.
One that I have here, under rare things. A son-in-law who's praised by his wife's father. Likewise, a wife who's loved by her mother-in-law.
So true.
Okay, I'm gonna share 2 contrasting things that Arthur Whaley says, because sometimes I'm like, shut up, Arthur, and then sometimes I'm like, all right, that was nice, that was well said. And again, like his commentary is just scattered through the whole book, so it's hard to like separate them. But when he's talking about this period in Japan, it was a purely aesthetic and above all a literary civilization. Never, among people of exquisite cultivation and lively intelligence, have purely intellectual pursuits played so small a part. What strikes us most is the past was almost a blank, not least so the history of Japan, extending even in mythological theory only to the 7th century BC and remaining fabulous for 1500 years. Like, it just, I don't know, for him to be like, well, they were smart, but they didn't do smart things. They just wasted their time. And also, like, again, the Japan not caring about the past, like,
It's very weird.
It's very weird. It's very weird. And there's like a lot, like that's not by any means the most dramatic example, but that was one of them that I marked. But then he says stuff that I like, where he's talking about shonagon herself, The character of Shonagon appears in her book as a series of contradictions. She is desperately anxious not merely to be liked, but to occupy the foremost place in the affections of all whom she knows. Yet her behavior, as she herself records it, seems consistently calculated to inspire fear rather than affection. Again, she seems at some moments wholly skeptical, at others profoundly religious, now unusually tender-hearted, now egotistical and cold. Yet all this does not imply that her character was in reality complicated to an unusual degree, but comes from the fact that she reveals herself to us entirely, and, as it were, from every facet, whereas most writers of diaries and the like, however little conscious intention they may have of publishing their confessions, instinctively present themselves always in the same light. Her detachment about herself is paralleled by a curious aloofness from all the associated emotions of a scene, so that she can describe a sickbed as though it were a sunset, without the slightest attempt to arouse pity, or for that matter, the least fear of provoking disgust. Like, that was a long one, but I don't know. I do like the way that he talks about her and kind of like admires her.
Yeah.
I feel like it's very akin to the things that we were saying, but he said it very nicely.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I have a few under things it's frustrating and embarrassing to witness.
Oh, God.
even the heading is strong.
A guest has arrived and you're sitting talking when people inside begin a conversation of a confidential nature, and you have to sit there hearing it, powerless to stop them. Similarly, your lover becomes terribly drunk and starts coming out with confidential things where he can be overheard. Someone starts talking about another person, unaware that he's sitting within earshot. This is very embarrassing, even if the person concerned is a mere servant or not someone of consequence. Someone insists on telling you about some horrid child, carried away with her own infatuation with the creature, imitating its voice as she gushes about the cute and winning things it says. A person of no learning making ostentatious use of famous names in front of someone truly learned. And finally, it's also painfully embarrassing to have to stand by and hear someone proudly reciting to others a poem of theirs that isn't really much good, or bragging about the praise they've received for it.
Oh, girl. She did have a lot of very strong opinions about parents and children and babies.
Yeah.
There was one section where she was like, all babies should be fat. And I was like, okay, take it easy. Like, they're doing their best.
Yep.
I have this little section. I was going to say I particularly like. That's her words right now. Features that I particularly like in someone's face continue to give a thrill of delight, however often I see the person. With pictures, it is different. If I look at them too often, they cease to attract me. Indeed, I never so much as glance at the beautiful paintings on a screen that stands near my usual seat. There is something really fascinating about beautiful faces. Though an object such as a vase or a fan may be ugly in general, there's always one particular part that one can gaze at with pleasure. And then, of course, she has to end it like this. One would expect this to apply to faces also, but alas, there's nothing to recommend an ugly face.
Yeah.
It was lovely until that.
Honestly, considering how much she talks about people she finds ugly, she better be gorgeous.
I know, right? Like, I would love to see a portrait.
Yeah. This is just like a really beautiful nature description. I love to cross a river in very bright moonlight and see the trampled water fly up in chips of crystal under the oxen's feet.
Under startling and disconcerting things, someone bluntly saying things that are embarrassing and unpleasant for the other person.
Oh boy.
This is hilarious to me. So she's talking about, I think one of the religious ceremonies and like the people who recite there. A recitant ought to be good looking. It is only if it is a pleasure to keep one's eyes on him all the time that there is any chance of religious feeling being aroused. Otherwise, one begins looking at something else, and soon one's attention wanders from what he is reading, in which case ugliness becomes an actual cause of sin. I'm like, I don't think so.
But it does It does kind of have like a Jane Austen-ish quality to it.
It really does. It really does. Like,
if only the new preacher was attractive.
So I have one that starts with, and it's a bit long, but I love it, and you'll see why. I really can't understand people who get angry when they hear gossip about others. How can you not discuss other people? Apart from your own concerns, what can be more beguiling to talk about and criticize than other people? But sadly, it seems wrong to discuss others, not to mention the fact that the person who's talked about can get to hear of it and be outraged. Of course, if it's someone you have a close bond with, you pause and consider the pain you might cause and choose to keep your criticism to yourself. Though if it weren't someone close to you, you'd no doubt go ahead and say it and have a laugh at their expense. And I'm like, I not to. I tried giving up gossip for Lent one year and it didn't work.
Yeah. I found it really hilarious. And this is actually like something someone else said that she like repeats and talks about. But that guy who says it was a favorite saying of his that people never sent him poems so long as they liked him. It's a sure sign that they have turned against one, he used to say. When you have made up your mind that you can bear me no longer, just send me one of those and I shall know what to make of it. It actually, okay, it really makes me think of Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing. Oh, wait. I think it's her, where it's like one good sonnet can starve away love entirely. Unless it's very strong and healthy.
It's very good.
Yeah. Let's see.
There's one where she's talking about a pond, but the last sentence of it I really like, which is just, all moonlight is moving, wherever it may be. And I'm like, yeah, I like moonlight.
Mm-hmm.
So real, queen.
Yeah.
That honestly, that is so true, because I just read yesterday a scene in which like the moon was shining down or whatever, and I was like swooning, and it was like, I think the moon just like brainwashed me. It really it's powerful.
Yeah. What was the exact word for that part, Taylor? I didn't hear some of it.
All moonlight is moving wherever it may be.
Yes, I remember reading that one too. I thought that was so pretty. Okay, I think this might be the last one, and this is another compare and contrast for our dear translator friend. So I'll start with like the unpleasant one. He's talking once again about Japan in this period. It is then not only their complete absorption in the passing moment, but more generally the entire absence of intellectual background that makes the ancient Japanese so different from us, and gives even to the purely aesthetic sides of their culture a curious quality of patchiness. And he just, goes on like that, incredibly condescending. I hate it. But on this same page, when he's talking about, I think he's talking about, let's see. Okay, yeah, so he's talking about like the influence of like scientists and philosophers and writers on like on culture, like on people who don't even like work in those disciplines specifically. And he says, but to most of us, their pronouncements are as unintelligible as the incantations of a llama. We are mere drones, slumbering amid the clatter of thoughts and contrivances that we do not understand and could still less ever have created. If the existence of contemporary research had no influence except upon those capable of understanding it, we should indeed be in much the same position as the people of Heian. But, strangely enough, something straggles through. Ideas that we do not completely understand modify our perceptions, and hence refashion our thoughts to such an extent that the society lady who said, Einstein means so much to me, was expressing a profound truth.
Yeah.
Of course, he's got to throw in that little racist bit in the middle, but like, I don't know.
I will say, like, despite the racism, he is a very talented writer. Like the way
he really is.
His ideas, it sounds like, at least, I guess pleasantry wouldn't be the right thing, but he's very good with like his diction and the way he puts sentences together.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree, and I feel like that's even shown by how I like marked so many of his quotes in both directions. You know, it's like there was some of them I was just like, wow, yikes, and then some of them I'm like, this is such a beautiful and yet concise way to like sum up these like huge ideas. Like even like the one I just read about a society lady saying Einstein means so much to me. Like that is so beautiful to me. Like that's like so moving to think that these people who do work in areas that none of us or concretely understand, that you're still affected by it, that you're still changed by it. I think that's really beautiful. And I would obviously include the people of Heian and other cultures, unlike the author, but yeah, I agree. I think some of his sentences are really, really beautiful.
Yeah.
Last call for quotes.
I think those are all mine.
Those are also all mine.
Beautiful. Well, as always, thank you both for the rousing conversation. I'm glad that this was overall an enjoyable reading experience. And Taylor, do you want to share what we're reading next?
Yes. So our September book is going to be, I literally just read it, Beloved by Toni Morrison. So I think we're going to be bringing the mood down a bit, but hopefully we'll still have a good time reading the book.
Right.
Depends
Very
on
rewarding.
what you guys know about Toni Morrison, but from what I hear, it's very good. So I'm excited to dive into it.
Ditto. Fantastic. Well, thank you both again. Thank you to those who were popping in and watching while we were live, and those of you who watch it back later. And we will see you in approximately a month. Bye.